today's story, we follow the Everest climb where a man was left for dead, but what happened next was unbelievable. Fueled by stubborn pride and 6 years of sacrifice, he refused to let anyone on that mountain decide his fate. The decisions that followed were so shocking that they divided the climbing community for years. It was April 9th, 2017, and a cold wind moved steadily through Everest Base Camp at 17,600 feet, carrying grit off the Khumbu Glacier and rattling the walls of expedition tents pitched across the moraine. The ice beneath camp groaned and shifted in a way that never became familiar, no matter how many nights a climber spent listening to it. Overhead, Everest's summit pyramid caught the last afternoon light, while everything below had already fallen into shadow. The scale of the mountain, compressing distance and making the upper slopes look deceptively close. Among the climbers settling into base camp that week was Daniel Kovac, a 38-year-old firefighter from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who had spent 14 years working engine companies on the city's south side. He was one of over 300 climbers spread across more than 30 expeditions on the glacier that spring, and the crowding reflected 2 years of pent-up demand. The 2014 icefall avalanche and the 2015 earthquake had shut down consecutive seasons, and 2016 had been a cautious return. By 2017, the backlog had broken open. Permit numbers were high. The icefall doctors were already fixing ladders through the Khumbu, and everyone understood that summit windows would mean crowded fixed lines, bottlenecked anchor points, and the kind of human traffic that turned simple delays into dangerous ones. He had saved for 6 years to afford this, cutting overtime checks into a separate account, selling a truck he didn't need, declining vacations that would have drained the fund. The expedition cost him $45,000 through a large commercial operator that ran tiered service packages, and Daniel was on the standard tier. Shared Sherpa support during rotations, one-on-one support above Camp 3, and a summit attempt within whatever weather window leadership approved. His climbing resume was modest but legitimate. He had summited Denali in 2014 and Aconcagua in 2015, both without incident. Neither required supplemental oxygen or death zone management, but both had given him experience with extreme cold and the particular exhaustion that came from hauling weight uphill for days. He was fit in the way firefighters tended to be: functional strength, cardiovascular endurance, and an ability to keep working long past the point where comfort ended. He arrived at base camp with no social media presence, no sponsors, and no audience. Everest was personal, something he had wanted since reading about Mallory in a library book as a teenager. Also on the expedition, having paid for the premium tier at $65,000 each, were Gavin Holt and James Arno. Gavin was 44, from London, and had built his money in commercial real estate development, buying distressed properties, converting them, and selling at margins that funded what he called high-performance leisure. He had summited Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, and Cho Oyu, the last giving him genuine 8,000-meter experience on a commercially guided expedition in 2015. Cho Oyu was straightforward by Himalayan standards, but it was still 26,864 feet, and standing on top of it had convinced Gavin that Everest was a matter of fitness, money, and willpower. James was 41, from Lyon, and had been Gavin's business associate and climbing partner for 5 years. Quieter, more technically capable, he had completed Cho Oyu alongside Gavin with fewer difficulties. But James's defining characteristic was deference. In business and on mountains, he followed Gavin's lead on every decision that mattered. His competence made him a reliable partner. His passivity made him a dangerous one. The premium tier bought dedicated Sherpa support from base camp upward, priority tent placement, and additional oxygen reserves. Gavin made sure other members knew the distinction. During the first group briefing, he interrupted repeatedly, asking about accelerated timelines, whether premium clients could bypass rotation protocols, whether extra oxygen could compensate for slower acclimatization. The expedition leader responded with practiced patience, explaining that altitude physiology did not recognize payment tiers. Daniel observed these exchanges without commenting. He recognized the type, someone who had succeeded by pushing through obstacles in environments where pushing worked, and who hadn't learned that mountains operated differently. Gavin noticed Daniel too, though the attention was less generous. Over the following days, he made remarks within earshot about the pace of standard tier climbers, about firefighter salaries and preparation budgets, about the gap between serious investors and people who scraped together enough to tag along. The comments carried the practiced casualness of someone who had spent decades making others feel small without saying anything direct enough to confront. Daniel registered every word and responded to none of them. Assigned to Daniel for the upper mountain was Jangbu Nuru, a 36-year-old guide from the Tem Valley in Nepal's Khumbu region. Jangbu had spent 12 years guiding and had summited Everest 5 times. He was known among operators as exceptionally steady, not the fastest or strongest Sherpa, but unshakably calm in crises and fiercely protective of his clients. He supported elderly parents and a younger brother, studying engineering in Kathmandu, and his guiding income was the family's primary stability. Jangbu and Daniel's working relationship developed through the acclimatization rotations with very little conversation. Both were workers by nature, communicating through pace and rhythm, through the small courtesies of sharing a stove or adjusting a load without being asked. At Camp 3 on the Lhotse face at 24,500 feet, Jangbu noted Daniel's stable oxygen saturation and reported to the expedition leader that he was well acclimatized and likely to manage the summit push without complications. The contrast with how Gavin treated his own support, issuing instructions about load management, adjusting oxygen flow based on his own research rather than his Sherpa's experience, was visible to everyone in camp. During rotations, Gavin pushed aggressively, treating each transition as a race. James matched him by default. Both acclimatized adequately, thanks to their Cho OU baseline, but the margins were thinner than they realized. Gavin dismissed headaches at Camp 2 as normal. James developed a persistent cough above 23,000 feet that he treated with medication rather than rest. Neither issue was disqualifying, but both signaled bodies, spending reserves that would not be available later. On May 17th, the expedition leader announced a summit window around May 20th. The plan was standard: depart base camp on the 18th, push to Camp 4 on the 19th, begin the summit attempt at 11 p.m., and aim for the top by mid-morning on the 20th. The briefing emphasized turnaround times. Anyone not on the summit by 1 p.m. was to turn around regardless of position. Gavin nodded through this with the detached compliance he had shown all season. Teams departed on May 18th and moved upward over 36 hours. Daniel and Jangbu reached Camp 4 on the South Col at approximately 26,000 feet, around 4 p.m. on May 19th. The col was a windswept saddle between Everest and Lhotse. Exposed, desolate, brutal. Tents shuddered in gusts that arrived without pattern, their fabrics snapping hard enough to sound like gunshots. Spindrift poured across the rocky ground in low rivers of ice crystals, collecting against packs and burying anything left unsecured. The air was thin enough that even crawling into a sleeping bag left climbers breathless, and the cold had a density to it that penetrated every layer and settled into the bones like something permanent. Climbers lay in their bags, forcing fluids and calories into systems that wanted neither, while Sherpas moved between tents, checking oxygen systems and organizing gear for the midnight push. Daniel rested, ate what he could manage, and reviewed his oxygen setup with Jangbu. 2 cylinders, a primary with regulator attached, and a spare secured to the outside of his pack. Jangbu confirmed both were full, checked the regulator, and walked Daniel through the valve clearing procedure in case of icing. The summit push began at 11 p.m. Headlamps switched on across the col one by one, and climbers filed onto the fixed ropes, a long, slow procession of light ascending into the dark, the line stretching upward until individual beams merged into a single, trembling thread against the mountain's black face. The sky was clear and dense with stars, the wind manageable but constant, and the cold was the kind that settled into joints and made every movement feel mechanical, as though the body had been replaced by something heavier and less cooperative. At anchor transition points, climbers stacked up, waiting to unclip and reclip ascenders in a process that multiplied across dozens of people into delays of 15 or 20 minutes. Standing still at 27,000 feet in the dark, the body lost heat faster than it could generate it. Daniel reached the balcony at roughly 27,500 feet around 3:30 a.m. His systems were functioning. Oxygen steady, coordination intact, thoughts clear enough for the route's technical demands. Jiangbu confirmed they were on pace. They rested briefly and continued upward along the ridge. Above the balcony, the route narrowed and steepened, exposure on both sides, the southwest face dropping left, the Kangsheng face falling right. It was here, at approximately 27,600 feet, that Daniel's primary oxygen regulator began to fail. The failure started with reduced flow, a gradual thinning that Daniel initially attributed to breathing rhythm rather than equipment. Over 10 minutes, the flow dropped until barely perceptible. Ice had built in the regulator valve, a common failure where moisture in the breathing circuit froze and progressively blocked the mechanism. Daniel stopped, set his pack down beside the route, and attempted to clear the valve. His gloves made fine motor work impossible. The components required precision that thick insulated gloves could not provide, and removing them meant exposing fingers to -30 degrees Fahrenheit before wind chill. He worked for several minutes without success. His supply effectively cut to ambient air at 27,600 feet, roughly a third of sea level. The effect was rapid. His thinking slowed. His movements became clumsy. Within 15 minutes, he had slumped against the slope next to his pack, head drooping, his brain shutting down non-essential functions to preserve whatever remained. Jiangbu was not beside him. At the last anchor transition, a bottleneck had developed. Climbers from 3 expeditions stacking at a single changeover point. The separation was no more than 10 minutes in climbing time, roughly 200 vertical feet. But in the death zone, 10 minutes was enough for everything to change. Gavin and James were in the same queue behind Jiangbu. When the bottleneck cleared, they pushed past at a section where the line allowed room and reached Daniel's position first. What happened next was reconstructed afterward from fragments, observations by passing climbers, comments overheard at Camp 4, details that only became meaningful when assembled alongside everything that followed. No single witness saw the complete sequence. They found Daniel slumped beside his pack, unresponsive, mask loose, regulator iced. Several climbers who passed described his appearance in similar terms. Motionless, head down, no reaction to headlamps or proximity. He looked like a climber who had stopped for the last time. Gavin crouched near Daniel's pack. One passing climber recalled seeing a figure kneeling beside a backpack, handling equipment, though darkness and distance prevented identification. What was certain was that when Jiangbu arrived minutes later, Daniel's spare oxygen cylinder, the backup with a functional regulator, his only recovery option, was gone. The straps that secured it hung loose. Gavin and James were already above, climbing toward the south summit. Neither had radioed base camp or alerted Jiangbu. Gavin carried a functioning radio and chose not to use it. No call for help was made. They had assessed the situation, taken what they determined useful, and continued. That failure to radio would become one of the most damning details in the reconstruction that followed. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. Jiangbu arrived to find Daniel in severe hypoxic decline, shallow breathing, no response to voice, minimal response to touch. The primary regulator was frozen. The spare was gone. What Jiangbu did next cost him his reserves, and eventually, his career. He removed his outer mitts and began working on the regulator with only liner gloves. The valve assembly required precise manipulation, clearing ice from the housing, freeing the flow mechanism, testing connections. At 27,600 feet, in darkness and blowing a spindrift, the work demanded dexterity that altitude and cold existed specifically to destroy. His fingers lost sensation within minutes. The liner gloves provided almost no thermal barrier, and the metal components conducted cold directly into tissue, already struggling with reduced circulation. He worked for 15 to 20 minutes with mitts off, and the frostbite that would end his career began during those first exposed moments and deepened with everyone that followed. Simultaneously, he redirected his own oxygen toward Daniel's mask. The regulator cleared. Oxygen flowed. Jiangbu held the mask in place, while supplemental air slowly pulled Daniel back from the edge. Recovery was not instant. 20 minutes before his eyes tracked movement. Another 10 before he responded to instructions. Another 10 before he could grip Jiangbu's arm and begin understanding where he was. The total crisis consumed roughly 90 minutes. Dawn was approaching by the time Daniel could stand. Jiang Bu radioed base camp, reported the regulator failure and missing cylinder. The expedition leader advised immediate descent. The exchange became part of the expedition record. Jiang Bu's recommendation matched base camp's. Go down. Daniel had suffered severe hypoxia. His spare oxygen was gone. His margin was erased. Camp 4 was 1,600 feet below. Survivable. Daniel refused. Not with words. He was not capable of that yet. Not with a brain still recovering from prolonged oxygen deprivation. He shook his head when directed downward. He pointed up. When Jiang Bu gestured again, toward Camp 4, Daniel turned and began moving upward. The refusal was physical, not philosophical, a body expressing a decision the mind could not yet articulate. Others would later attribute meaning to the moment. 6 years of savings, being robbed and left for dead. The summit as the only thing that could transform what happened from a story about a victim into something else. Those interpretations came afterward, from people with oxygen and the luxury of analysis. At 27,600 feet, the decision was simpler and more primal than any of that. Jiang Bu protested. Everything from 12 years of guiding said this was wrong. But Daniel was standing, moving under his own power, making a choice with enough cognition to understand the direction. And letting Daniel climb alone was more dangerous than going with him. A Sherpa did not abandon a mobile client on the upper mountain. Jiang Bu followed against his own recommendation, against base camp's advice, and because the only thing worse than going up was letting his client go up alone. They climbed. Daniel's pace was desperately slow, every step a negotiation between the body's demand to stop and whatever deeper mechanism kept his legs moving. But the regulator held. Jiang Bu monitored constantly, gripping the fixed rope with wrist loops and forearm pressure, because his fingers could no longer close around the line. 5 previous summits had given him body memory of this route that did not require his hands. But the adaptation came at a cost that would only reveal itself fully at lower altitudes. They reached the south summit around 10 a.m. The Hillary step required focused climbing that Daniel managed with mechanical determination. Jiang Bu stayed within arm's reach, ready to arrest a fall that would have taken them both off the ridge. They reached the summit of Mount Everest at approximately 12:15 p.m. on May 20th, 2017. Dangerously, almost recklessly late, exceeding every turnaround guideline by over an hour. The sky was still clear above them, but clouds had begun building far below, filling the valleys between the surrounding Himalayan peaks like water rising in a basin. The wind was steady and cold enough that standing still meant losing heat faster than the body could replace it. There was no celebration. Daniel stood on the highest point for less than 2 minutes. Jiang Bu checked the time, checked the sky, checked the mask seal, and they started down. Every minute above 28,000 feet was borrowed against a balance already overdrawn. The descent moved faster, but the toll was visible in every step. Daniel's crampons found terrain by memory, more than sight. The prolonged immobility during his hypoxic episode and the extreme length of the day were extracting a quiet cost from his extremities, frostbite developing in his fingers and toes as reduced circulation and sustained cold worked beneath insulation that was no longer enough. On the ridge below the south summit, between approximately 28,300 and 28,500 feet, they encountered what remained of Gavin Holt's summit ambition. Gavin and James had reached the summit earlier. Other climbers estimated 8:30 to 9 a.m. Their dedicated Sherpas had summited with them, but Gavin had sent both down ahead, insisting he and James would follow shortly. It was consistent with the pattern he had established all season, overriding support staff, treating their judgment as optional, making decisions for the group based on his own assessment of what was manageable. The Sherpas descended to Camp 4 expecting their clients behind them. When Gavin and James failed to appear within a reasonable window, the Sherpas reported the delay, but by then, exhaustion and conditions made a return to the upper mountain impossible. The safety net Gavin had paid $65,000 for had been dismissed by the man who purchased it, but the summit was not where their problems began. Their problems had been accumulating all season. Gavin's aggressive pacing that burned reserves faster than they could be replaced. James's passive compliance that locked him to Gavin's tempo. The thin margins they had masked with medication and willpower. The summit was simply where the debt came due. Their descent had been an agonizingly slow deterioration. James showed signs of cerebral edema within the first hour, confused responses, lost coordination, progressive disconnection between intent and movement. His pace dropped to near zero. Gavin tried to physically move him, burning whatever he had left on a crisis that required reserves he had already spent. Over 3 to 4 hours, they descended only a few hundred vertical feet, stalling on the ridge as James's condition consumed everything Gavin could give. James was sitting in the snow off the fixed line, not moving purposefully. His body shifted occasionally, involuntary adjustments disconnected from intent. Mask loose, pack half open, the vacant expression and dissociation of advancing cerebral edema. Gavin was nearby, still upright, but barely, moving between James and the fixed line in a pattern that suggested repeated failed attempts to get James standing. His own gait was deteriorating, stumbling, overcorrecting, coordination being consumed faster than he could compensate. Gavin saw Daniel coming down the fixed line. Even through goggles and oxygen mask, the recognition was visible. A change in posture, a stillness. The man he had left dying hours earlier was descending from the summit, alive, moving, looking directly at him. Gavin gestured, an arm toward James, then toward Daniel and Jangbu. The universal language of someone asking for help they could not provide themselves. Daniel reached their position. He slowed. Several seconds passed, long enough that 2 descending climbers and a Sherpa from another expedition all later described the moment independently. Their accounts aligned on essentials and diverged on interpretation. Daniel paused at the point on the line closest to Gavin and James. He appeared to look at both men. Then he continued descending without stopping, and Jangbu followed. What that pause contained was never established. Some witnesses described a man too depleted to help. Daniel had been climbing over 13 hours on a single cylinder after a severe hypoxic episode, and mounting a rescue at 28,400 feet under those conditions was arguably beyond what his body could manage regardless of intent. Others described a man who looked, understood, and chose to keep walking. The 2 readings were separated by the question of intent, and intent at 28,000 feet, behind goggles, behind a mask, behind the fog of hypoxia, was not something anyone could verify from the outside. Daniel never publicly addressed the moment. Jangbu, when asked, said only that they were descending and that stopping was not something either of them could afford. Daniel and Jangbu reached Camp 4 by early evening, roughly 6 hours after leaving the summit. A descent slowed by Daniel's deteriorating coordination and Jangbu's compromised hands. The last hour had been the hardest, both men moving on something deeper than willpower, their bodies operating on residual momentum that felt like it could stop at any moment and never restart. They spent the night on the South Col and continued down through the lower camps the following day, reaching base camp on May 22nd. Daniel was treated for moderate frostbite on several fingers and toes, damage attributed to the prolonged immobility during his hypoxic episode and the extended summit day, along with dehydration and residual neurological effects of oxygen deprivation. He recovered physically over the following weeks. The long-term cognitive effects of his hypoxic episode were never publicly discussed. James Arnault was found dead on the ridge below the south summit. 2 days later, he had not moved from where Daniel last saw him, death attributed to cerebral edema and exposure. Gavin Holt's body was discovered near the balcony at approximately 27,500 feet. He had apparently attempted to descend alone after James became immovable, made it roughly 1,000 vertical feet before collapsing. Death attributed to exhaustion, hypoxia, and exposure. Both bodies were left on the mountain. Jangbu Nuru lost the index and middle fingers on his right hand and the ring finger on his left, all amputated at or near the second knuckle. The nerve damage extended beyond the amputation sites into both hands, permanently compromising grip strength and fine motor control. Managing rope systems, operating carabiners and ascenders, the precise equipment work that high-altitude guiding demanded, none of it was possible anymore with the reliability that clients' lives required. He never returned to guiding above base camp. The career that supported his family ended on a dark slope above the balcony, in 20 minutes spent saving someone else's life. The full account was assembled gradually from overlapping witness statements, expedition radio logs, and the physical evidence of a missing cylinder. Gavin's failure to radio Daniel's condition, despite carrying a functioning radio, was noted as one of the most damning details. Some facts remained disputed. Some were never confirmed. The debate over Daniel's decision to walk past Gavin and James never resolved. Some condemned him. Others pointed out that Gavin and James had made the identical choice hours earlier, and that at 28,000 feet, no one owed anything beyond their own survival. Whether what happened on that ridge was justice or cruelty, or simply the mountain enforcing its own arithmetic, depended on where a person stood, and no one who wasn't there, breathing that air, carrying that weight, had earned the right to be certain. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.